So one of the things that I like about my show is that I have the opportunity to talk to a wide range of people uh, along multiple axes, and one of those is essentially how well known someone is. Obviously, many of the people I talk to are established figures, but the man I'm speaking to tonight is a relative newcomer. He and I have spoken, at length on different live streams before, but have never done a full episode. And so I'm really excited to bring on my guest tonight. But before I get into that, a brief word from our sponsor. Actually, before I get into that brief word from our sponsor, you may notice this episode does not have an intro. And that is thanks to the overlords at YouTube, who, after years of me using that intro, have decided that that is copywritten material. And so, you know what? No intro. A new one is currently being composed, but that takes time. So, yeah, sorry about that. But anyway, here's a brief message from Axios, and then I'll bring our guest on. All right, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Burden.
So, if you could you briefly describe kind of who you are and what you do on the internet?
Sure. I'm a small anonymous poster on Twitter, and I write on Substack. My handle on Twitter is Tuna RJS, and on Substack I co-run a Substack with my podcast co-host and sometime co-author Landon Connor, and we're at the crux of the matter. But basically, what I do is I kind of bring a Gen Z and a Christian perspective to things that are going on around the interwebs.
Well, fair enough. I think that I first became aware of your work because of one of these kind of shadowy behind the scenes Twitter group chats, which is basically how absolutely everything on our side of the internet gets done. And yeah, it was obviously there's a lot of people I'd heard of there, but I kind of became aware of your stuff and was really impressed by it. So I'm looking forward to speaking to you today.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that.
So there are several articles that we could go through. And you and I obviously are of a similar generation, roughly the same age. And you wrote an article on the case for the Gen Z white pill that obviously other writers have made similar points, but I think that it neatly expresses ideas that if I have had. So if you could, maybe let's first define our terms. What do we mean by Gen Z? And then maybe we could get into the thesis of that article. Why you think there's a white pill in that generational cohort.
Sure. The way to define Gen Z, it's a little loose because when people organize the generations, they don't exactly pick particular years. I've heard before that Gen Z starts in like as early as 96 or 97. I've heard it starts as late as 2001, but it's essentially the age where you're not old enough to remember 9/11. And I would say the youngest Gen Z is maybe, born in 2012 ish. And then we start getting into Gen Alpha. But the the reason that I wrote the article was because like it's just kind of taken for granted that young people are like going to be awful and stupid and they're going to grow up to be like the worst progressive foot soldiers ever. They were like raised on iPads, et cetera, that sort of thing. And I just don't see it when I interact with other people of my generation. And so I think that we live in extremely abnormal times, whereas the vast majority of time in human history, people who are alive didn't have to think about politics really. And in the spicy times, as Charles Haywood would call them, everyone has to think about them. And in the old world, that would be like, sort of civil wars in medieval Europe. All of a sudden, the problem of the political would be thrust upon people. But I think that living in a society where basically every single tradition at a cultural, political, religious, mythological level even is being attacked, that all of the people in my generation are sort of forced to confront. Um, issues of meaning in a way that very few generations in the history of the world actually have had all of these options thrown before them about what they might come to believe about the world because they actually get no answers as a given. And so I think that the as soon as I noticed that, I said that there's a lot of potential for Gen Z, and obviously there's a lot of awful members of my generation, to say the least. But I think that the good ones in Gen Z are going to be really good because they've had to define who they are in relation to um, the people around them, their communities, their nation, what a nation even is actually, their religion, what they want their life to look like, and what they want the future to look like for their country. And, at least two or three of those questions in ages past would have been handed to you on a silver platter. Not that that's a bad thing. It's very hard to make meaning yourself out of nothing. But I think that if you're the type of person who will make it through and be able to define meaning for yourself in basically every facet of your life, and you're able to reach the correct conclusions, they'll be basically the sharpest right wingers and the sharpest Christians, etc., sharpest Americans, whatever group that they're a part of that there have ever been. And I think that that was a little bit of a gamble for me to write that. I think I wrote it in like very beginning of 2023, so like almost a year and a half ago. And I think it's aged pretty well because a couple of other people have latched on my thesis. I saw Aaron Wrenn had an article. It was something like "Why I'm Bullish on Gen Z," and he made a lot of similar points to me. So I'm glad that for once, one of my takes is aged pretty well.
It's something that I noticed as well. When we talk about whatever you want to call it, the crisis of meaning, it really is kind of a crisis of civic religion, right? The kind of core basic moral precepts that are at the center of a society. And there's a lot of desire in broadly right wing, shall we say, more conservative circles to return to a time at which there was a mutually agreed upon kind of conduct, a code of conduct, if you will. And this was, close enough to kind of Protestant Christian moral precepts that it kind of worked, right? This is the way that our system was designed for everyone to have certain things in common. And obviously, much has been written on the point that is no longer the case. We no longer live in a cohesive society. And obviously we can sort of decry that. I wish we lived in a cohesive society. But one, we don't. We don't really have the opportunity to just turn back the clock. But two, I think it's very reasonable to look at that pre-existing moral order. And the reason that it fell apart is, not to put on a Marxist hat, but it had internal contradictions. It became unbelievable at a certain point. And I think that, looking at, Gen Z, you're very right that it is a group of people who grew up after that consensus, whether you want to call it the post-war consensus, the liberal consensus had fallen apart. And it's one of the reasons that, one of the slurs you oftentimes hear directed at people our age is, oh, they're constantly changing their ideology. He was a communist, last year, now he's a, national socialist or something kind of similarly ridiculous. But I think the core reason for that is that there is no, commonly held set of moral precepts anymore. And the conservative desire to kind of reinstate that, I mean, I understand it, but you're fundamentally, praying to a dead god, right? You're trying to rejuvenate a civic religion that literally no one believes in anymore. This is, I think, what you see in the term the woke right from the more kind of, centrist to liberal Christian types, is that they see people like you and I who are saying, that previous moral order was wrong. It had flaws in it, and say, well, that's the same thing as, the horrible progressive leftists. And from one singular perspective, that is true. Obviously, in anything that matters, yeah, that's flagrantly a stupid comparison. But nonetheless, I think that the fact that you have young people who are not buying into, this kind of liberal consensus, I see that as very much a sign for optimism. So it's interesting that you also notice that same dynamic.
Yeah, I think your bit about making fun of people who change their ideology, and I do see that happen a lot, and I get it. Like in any other time, it would make sense to make fun of that person as sort of like a rootless, like floundering person looking for meaning. Actually, it's like making fun of a drowning person. That's what it's like. Because that person, like in ages past, like obviously there have been civic religions that have been replaced by something else. Rome leads to the Goths. The the Roman sort of authorities are supplanted by the church. Eventually, the Roman Catholic Church is supplanted by Protestants. Protestants in the 18th and 19th centuries in some places are replaced by secularists, but you're going from one narrative to another. And now, with the sort of all consuming liberal democracy, everyone's equal, egalitarianism, with all of the attaches like feminism, those like that now that that narrative and that civic religion is collapsing, there's actually nothing to replace it. There's been no there's been no coherent objections to it. There's been no entire civic religion. There's been thousands of mini religions, which is why people can change their mind so drastically. Because what everyone realizes is that actually 20th century liberal democracy sucks. And like, at least like democracy already sucks, but even for the normal person, they were promised that if they all agree on something, they will get it. And what happens over and over, to take like the most mainstream issue ever, a majority of Americans, way back when Bush Jr. was president, wanted to have a constitutional amendment to clarify that marriage could only ever be between a man and a woman in the eyes of the state. And people said, oh, this is a distraction. This is moral majority. This is just like the satanic panic. This is like never going to happen. And then, oops, it happens. And even California, which votes against gay marriage in like Proposition 8 or whatever, uh, reject gay marriage. 2 years later, Obergefell happens. Gay marriage is now the law of the land nationally. And on top of it, like you can be fired for saying that, I actually don't think that was the greatest decision. I actually don't think that two men or two women can get married. And, like nothing about the system works as promised. And now, like even economically, like, are we actually richer for having like this abstract commitment to like no tariff barriers and free markets and corporations can actually do whatever they want? It's like all of the narratives at once are collapsing, and which is why there's 1,000 things to replace them. And obviously that could lead to disaster for Gen Z, but I do think there's a lot of potential there for us to kind of get some of the good ones.
And I think that there's several dynamics at work here, excuse me. One of which is that the data about people our age being gay communists, I'm not going to dispute that, right? There's an immense amount of young people who self-describe as racial or sexual minorities for personal gain, and that's not ideal. But we're not the Mormons here. We don't need 50 plus 1%. To me, the lessons of kind of the failures of democracy, the lessons of the failures of populism, is that this is not a simple vote gathering endeavor. We're really looking for a vanguard. And so to me, this seems like a generation that is primed to be part of that vanguard. Also, one of the other kind of byproducts of both older people enjoying, making fun of younger people and the culture war is the kind of rise of people like libs of TikTok or any one of these, pages that will oftentimes chronicle these like young people obsessed with neo pronouns, right? The themsers, the like truly, you know, despicable gender goblins. But that is a symptom of a broader cause, and that is a symptom of a lack of identity. It is a desire to create an identity for yourself because there is none to be found in kind of general society in the way that, in a previous era, you would gain a sense of identity from your religious community, from your family, from your place of work. All of that has been made much more difficult. And so now, if you're the type of person, Tuna, like you or I, that is, in the business of offering, a worldview that gives you meaning, right? In the business of offering an answer to that crisis of identity. Well, you couldn't ask for a a better target market to kind of adopt a business stance here. You couldn't ask for people who are more desperate for a true and real identity that's more resonant than just what combination of stacked genitalia do I prefer?
Yeah, you're dealing with a bunch of thirsty people, and you can sell them poison or you can sell them water and Gatorade, and you gotta pick which one.
Yeah, it's and then look, like I definitely understand the the kind of doom and gloom outlook, right? Things are not going well, in a broader sense, right? It is so over, to quote Pete Hitchens. But within that, I think that there's a psychological desire to just give up. It's pointless. There's no sense in fighting it. And I think that that's really poisonous because obviously, we can look around at our peers, people who have made that transformation and see like this is a possible thing. And we're never going to get everyone, but we don't need everyone. And I think one of the other reasons that there are so many young people being pushed towards the serious right is effectively that the sort of social forces that conservatives and those to the right of center have been pointing out, whether it's affirmative action or any form of kind of discrimination against straights, whites, and Christians. And I think you and I happen to be in the perfect middle of that Venn diagram. But all of a sudden, you have people who in a functional social order would not be interested in politics. They'd be, working hard, they'd be building a family. And now when that option is not open to them or is much, much harder, you have people who are competent, who are capable, who've been pushed to the margins. And again, going back to that idea of a vanguard, I see that as a very hopeful sign.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that if I were to describe the sort of malaise that people are in and the what the civic religion has produced, it's apathy. And what follows apathy is a search for meaning. And I think that, there's a like we've been hammering and walking around in circles in the same point, but like we all right, here's the opportunity, put me in, coach. Like this is the good thing about the serious right is that they actually like bother to answer questions about what happens when two ethnicities have to share a nation, or how males and females ought to structure their roles in a society, whereas the sort of new right that is now the old right, the neocons, like just didn't bother with any of that, and we're just like, I think that we should go blow up thousands of people in the Middle East so they can have democracy, which they also won't get. It's just kind of like self-evidently farcical on its face. And the problem with our times now is not just that they suck, but that they're kind of funny. And that's another opportunity. We can be happy warriors while we're fighting away stupidity, boredom, and evil, which is kind of what our enemies are. They're stupid, they're boring, and they are evil.
I think that that is a perfect note to wrap up that segment of the discussion. There's another article that you wrote that I found quite interesting. I wanted to go through. And that is an article you wrote on C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis has a mixed reputation in our circles because he is oftentimes the only figure that a certain brand of kind of spineless conservative has ever heard of. And so you oftentimes get the most annoying people imaginable quoting Lewis and kind of parading him as their figurehead. But you wrote a very thoughtful article on the man, kind of reframing his work. And so I'm curious, just as a sort of an opening device, could you describe how Lewis has been misused and why people in my audience might kind of get their hackles up when you talk about him?
Yeah, I mean, everyone has heard of C.S. Lewis, which is the big thing. Like if you had to pick a 20th century Christian, it's basically him, Tolkien, Dostoevsky, and like I don't know, Billy Graham. Like there's not a ton of picks, so everyone's heard of him, and part of everyone hearing of him is that everyone feels the need to have an opinion of him, and so like people in our spheres get upset because they'll see like you know some Russell Moore type Christian who's like in favor of infinity immigration and like very anti-racist, like quoting C.S. Lewis positively, and people will be like, "Oh, well, C.S. Lewis must not be convicting or something. He must not like be our guy. He must just be like another wishy-washy like teddy bear." And that's just not the case. when you've actually read lots of Lewis's work, because what people are familiar with is basically Narnia, the Chronicles of Narnia, and Mere Christianity. Maybe they have some like dabbling in the Screw Tape Letters, um, but a large like I've read most of Lewis's work that there is. I'm going to start Till We Have Faces this year, which I think is probably his only book that I haven't read.
Till
Um,
We Have Faces is quite good as someone who's recently read it. I'll just give a brief synopsis for the viewers at home. It's sort of a retelling of the story of Cupid and Psyche. It's very interesting thematically, and also sort of, I don't know, it offers a unique view into truly non-liberal morality. But anyway, sorry, back to you, man.
yeah, I am very excited to read it because I've heard lots of good reviews. But essentially, I've read everything that Lewis has to say, and the stereotype of him being soft and sort of jovial, and he never enters into any frivolous debates. He's just preaching the bare bones of Christianity. It's not right. And in his writing, he will like put his crosshairs directly on like egalitarianism, feminism, democracy. He's talked about the problems with science, the entire Enlightenment as a whole. He's possibly like one of the most he's just so in line with things that we we should be looking for as members of the real right, that it's just kind of not fair to just kind of toss him aside because he seems like a teddy bear. And he's misread all the time because he gets accused of being like an atheist subversive by like certain tradcasts. And if you go all the other way, he gets accused of being like a crypto papist by Calvinists. And it's very funny. Um, he's accused of being a liberal. He was accused of being a socialist. He like famously in a letter with Tolkien was like not so sure about Franco, and Tolkien says of him in the letter, he should know better because he knows these people, basically insinuating that everyone knows that Lewis is not a fan of he wasn't a fan of the 30s and 40s and 50s left. There was this funny article that said by the Foundation for Economic Education or whatever, calling him a libertarian. So he can just kind of be read as anything you want, and that's the problem. Is that happens to lots of people. That happens to like famous philosophical authors. Everyone wants to read. Everyone wants to hear what they want to hear, and I don't think that's right with Lewis. And I think that in the article, I lay out a bunch of specific quotes from him, from Mere Christianity, from Screw Tape Letters, Abolition of Man, from some of his private letters, just showing all of the particular ways in which he's actually very subversive to a egalitarian Enlightenment narrative, a leftist narrative. And he gets away with it because of his writing style, not because of the content of what he says.
I think that's a valid point. You know, there is something to be said for a figure, and actually, Tolkien is in a very similar situation where, you know, somehow the Tolkien Society is this like horrible like leftist operation, you know, despite the sort of the character of the man himself. And it would obviously be a mistake to throw him away just because of that. So what do you believe is the correct way to read Lewis?
Lewis is primarily concerned with people's hearts, in most of his writing, but when he gets around to the idealistic world and the philosophical world, he's extremely concerned with modern thinking being what was happening in the 40s. And what he's critiquing is what he predicted as the rise of secularism, but not quite like not quite all the way secularism. The term that he coined is the Materialist Magician. In and it's from the Screw Tape Letters, and the concept is basically that demons will kind of take one of two ways to tempt people in the world. One of which is by making people into magicians, like the dark arts, and satanic worship, and the other is to make them completely unaware of the demonic existence, to insist that the material is all there is. And the demon who's explaining this in the Screw Tape Letters says basically that they're going to reach a point, and this is Lewis predicting that the enemies of Christianity will reach a point where they're able to do both at once by essentially acting on behalf of the devil while believing he does not exist, and that is essentially what happened throughout the 20th century. And so Lewis will pick particular parts of that narrative, and he will kind of he'll push back on them very subtly. Um, he goes after he goes after democracy, saying that basically that men should be allowed to honor a king, which is like a weird thing for someone who's accused of being a liberal to say, if people don't honor a king, they'll honor all of these other awful people, celebrities, basically. Like, and that's kind of a intrinsic part of the human heart. Or when he says that democracy is a word that doesn't actually have any meaning, we just use it to make everyone feel included, which is another weird thing for a liberal to say. And he talks about the biggest thing is that the way he talks about equality between men is extremely like if you said this out loud now, you would be accused of being an extreme reactionary, and like no one notices it just because it's C.S. Lewis. And the quote that I should read, if I can pull it up here, it's very short, but he says, "Yeah, the feeling that democracy prompts is what prompts a man to say, 'I'm as good as you.' No man who says, 'I'm as good as you,' believes it. He wouldn't say it if he did. The St. Bernard never says it to the toy dog, nor the scholar to the dunce, no, nor the employable to the bum, nor the pretty woman to the plain. The claim to equality outside the strictly political field is made only by those who feel themselves to be in some way inferior." If you read that quote out of context, that reads like Nietzsche. you know? And so there are hundreds, there are thousands of these quotes where uh he goes after core tenets of what the left believes in the 20th century.
There's another quote that you have in your article, and I think that Lewis's Lewis's critique of democracy comes from his belief in beauty, and then from that hierarchy. His famous intro to the abolition of man, which is often quoted in these circles, R.N. McIntyre often talks about it, is him basically demolishing the way that this sort of critique from nowhere, all value is subjective, that idea as found in education. And there's a quote you put in the article that I'll read as well, where he sort of gets to a similar idea, kind of a radical critique of egalitarianism. Equality outside of mathematics is a purely social conception. It applies to man as a political and economic animal. It has no place in the world of the mind. Beauty is not democratic. She reveals herself more to the few than to the many, more to the persistent and disciplined seekers than to the careless. Virtue is not democratic. She is achieved by those who pursue her more hotly than most men. Truth is not democratic. She demands special talents and special industry to those whom she grants her favors. Political democracy is doomed if it tries to extend its demands for equality into those higher spheres. Ethical, intellectual, or aesthetic democracy is death. And I think that we can look at that quote, look around, and just say, yes, like that is plainly and manifestly true. That at the point at which you've decided to devote yourself to, equality in all things, right? Equality of a function of aesthetics, you get the lowest common denominator, right? Harrison de Bergeron is, obviously the kind of satirical example of that. But I mean, just simply look at, what is kind of paraded around as public art, right? In New Orleans for a while now, they've had, at the center of one of the city squares, this giant Afro hair pick, molded into kind of the outline of a BLM logo. And it's awful. It is not, in any way aesthetic or uplifting. It's simply a symbol of, political equality. And obviously, I'm not trying to overextend this, but I think your point about, if outside of context, this reads almost as Nietzschean, I think is very true. This is a fundamentally radical critique of, social egalitarianism that many of the people who have read one or two books by Lewis would themselves champion.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way you can reconcile that sentence with what liberals and even what sort of um, the Conank normie right types believe. Like, okay, all other things being equal, I believe this. Well, all other things are actually not equal, so that sentence doesn't mean anything. And you know, Lewis is he just there's just a grab bag of ideas like this, and I think that the one the one idea of progress that kind of underlies all of the others is that progress is like inevitable, and he goes after this again, saying that he was talking about sort of these skeptical young men in Britain post World War II who are kind of disillusioned with Christianity. They're disillusioned with the cause of the war. They kind of collapse into hedonism and secularism. And he was when he was describing them, what they were like when he was trying to sort of evangelize in his position as an older, wiser man. He said that they don't they don't believe we have any knowledge of historic man, but they also believe in prehistoric man. And because one is labeled science and one is labeled history, and like I think that the unique critique from him is that science is actually the the underlying motivating engine behind progress. And I think that capital P progress, I should say, the thing that the left subscribes to, that things are always getting better, more or less. Um, he said the way that he said it was the fatal serialism of the modern imagination, the image of infinite unilinear progression which so haunts our minds. And I think that that of all of his critiques of progressive belief, that is probably the best. Things are always getting better. They will never not get better. The right side of history is inevitable. Um, and if that's not like the core belief of progressivism, I don't know what is. Like there he okay, like here you go, two quotes. He's going after equality as a concept, and he says progress is not inevitable. Those are the two most anti-left beliefs that you could possibly have.
I think that it's always a difficult psychological trap on the right, which is, an internal desire to keep going, to keep digging, to find more and more obscure figures. And that's a noble goal, right? There's a lot of our history that has been buried. But there comes with that a sort of snobbishness to, yesterday's thinker. And I think that in much the same way that, people look at, someone like Burnham as kind of being old hat, there's a similar dynamic with Lewis, right? Which is that he's not cool, quote unquote, anymore. But I think that it's important to recognize, what's the reason for doing this? Is the reason to do this just to sort of be, the most, the most daring, the most edgy, or is it to genuinely discover truth? And I think that if we're interested in truth, it's foolish to throw away a figure like Lewis, who, despite being, shall we say, overused by our kind of center right compatriots, has genuinely radical thought, kind of outside of his, top three books. And I don't know, I share your frustration with people who just want to, throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, I mean, it happens a lot to like go and dig for the guy who like solved the Gordian knot of leftism and how we're going to beat it. But he's valuable because he's living in the middle of the left's total ascendancy. He died in like I think he died on the same day as JFK, which is kind of a crazy thing to think about within a couple hours of the president being shot. So he lived through I mean, he's a veteran of World War One. First of all, he's not some cushy academic. Like the guy shot at people, had his best friend in the bunks blown up in front of him. Like he's not a soft sort of person. But then, he goes through his academic career, converts to Christianity, friends with Tolkien, blah, blah, blah. Then he lives through World War II, and he is the voice of the British people on the BBC while they're being bombed by German planes. And then he sees the sort of post-war order begin to take place. And throughout the entire time, he's like, it's almost like he's like Jeremiah, aware of like the impending doom that's coming, and then he lives through the doom and like leaves us a set of instructions on how to avoid it. And in Jeremiah's case, it's okay, here's what these people did. Uh all of this awful degeneracy, but basically it all boils down to they didn't do what God said, and that's why they got carried away. And that is the simplest message that Lewis offers, which anyone can see, which is that in more or less words, like they didn't do what God said, here's why they're getting carried away. And he's like leaving us instructions on how to undo the machine that was being built and was completed while he was alive. And I think that, you know, you could, obviously whoever's listening can go and read the article and they can take a peek at all of the specific ways in which Lewis undermines egalitarian progressive liberalism. But I think that that's his core message is like kind of doing an altar call, and that's the part that isn't like that's the part that's not shiny, and that's the part that like people would rather avoid. But it's true because Europe reached its zenith under Christendom and worldwide expansion and imperialism and all of these things that we love to like say are like, super based and something that we would like to aim for. Well, if you want to aim for that, you have to go to the thing that built it. And Europe's collapse, like this is one thing, and I will be writing about this in the future. And it's something I've talked about a little bit, but in sort of to shift gears completely in the sort of whose fault is leftism, America or Europe debate that goes on, I'm like 100% in favor of the thesis that the left is Europe's fault because what America is America, or at least as it was intended to be designed, was the inheritance of old Europe. Whereas Europe, immediately after the Constitution is signed, within like 2 years, has the French Revolution. And from 1789 to 1848, Europe systematically deconstructs its Christian identity, and not in like an academic way, like taking all of the Christian kings and like impaling them and shooting them and exiling their foreign ministers out of the country and Metternich getting murdered and then a sort of extreme embrace of suicidal ideology like the birth control fiasco in France in the 19th century or Marxism which comes out of Europe. And I think that basically all of the core movements of the left, communism, anarchism, socialism, liberalism, to a lesser extent, feminism, all of those things have come from Europe, and they all came from Europe in the years after Europe decided that it was done with Christianity. And during the time that America was still a Christian country, I would say from Washington until maybe the very beginning of the 20th century, certainly under McKinley, who I'm writing another article about, America is like this nation where there's no federal church, but 9 of the 13 uh, states have like blasphemy laws on the books. A couple of them have state churches. Everyone attends a church in the United States. America is like a Christian country and experiences all this success while it is separated from the rapidly degenerating old world. And so I think that, that's a long rambling point, kind of getting off from the Lewis article, and I apologize for that. But I think that it's vital to understand where leftism comes from and how it manifests itself. And I think that the the instructions for the time bomb that was leftism were all written in Europe.
Not to derail this, but I don't know if I entirely buy your leftism comes from Europe thesis, but that's perhaps a discussion for another time. So, Big Tuna, this has been a really interesting conversation. I'm glad to have you on, but what's coming down the pipe? Like what are you working on and what are the next moves coming from your Substack and your podcast?
Sure. I've unfortunately, on the note of the podcast, really not been able to record anything. Um, me and Landon's schedules have gotten very different, and I've not been able to record any episodes, and I don't know that we will, um, because of his real life commitments. And there's possibly some restructuring coming down the line as far as the podcast goes. So I would keep an eye on that. Um, and but the thing that I'm working on right now is an article on William McKinley. And I read this book called William McKinley and His America by H. Wayne Morgan, which was just basically a biography and an overview of the man's life. But I think he's one of the most remarkable figures that there's been in American history. He kind of gives us a blueprint of what the American political right was about and should be about. And, obviously people talk all the time about Buckley replacing the old right in the 1950s, but the vision for the right was laid out by McKinley in the 1890s and at the beginning of the 1900s before he was assassinated by an immigrant anarchist assassin. Um, and so I'm writing a little bit about the man's life and about what he can teach us. And I have another note in there that I've been writing, and that's why it was supposed to be out earlier, but it's not out yet. Maybe it will by the time of this episode's release. But also what he teaches us about the figure of the American great man, because there's all this talk about Caesarism and great men and the Christian prince, and what does that all mean? Is that something coming down the pipe? Is it something we already had? And I plan to offer my take on that.
Great, man. That sounds really exciting. I'm obviously, a fan of your blog. I'm excited to read more. And again, man, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
As far as my stuff, you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I do technically have a Substack. I've not written in it in several months because I have had nothing worthwhile to say. Note that has not stopped me from having a podcast, but at the very least, it has stopped me from writing. Also, highly recommend that you support the show if you can. The best way to do that is by leaving a review. I check my reviews roughly once a year, and I think that they are kind of funny. So if that sounds like something you'd be up for, I'd appreciate it. You can also support the channel by checking out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. JD is eternally patient with my, shall we say, half-hearted efforts at training the last month. Work has been busy. But again, guys, thanks for sticking with it. And to everyone at home, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.